Hello everyone, good evening. So, today I am starting what is going to be week by week thing discussing this book, The Nature of Order. This is specifically book 1, written by Christopher Alexander. There are good discussions of this online and going on in the world, and indeed it was a big part of courses I taught in Italy and what Brian, my colleague, had studied. I think it's valuable to take time with this. I'm going to be going chapter by chapter. Today is going over the prologue and the preface. So this is by Christopher Alexander. It is about architecture and how we can address the current problems in architecture very pragmatically, but by going very deep. It is called an essay on the art of building and the nature of the universe. And so this is to give you an overview, this going to be an ongoing thing. By the way, my History of Architecture podcast was really looking ahead to this. This was published in 2002, and I feel very fortunate to have taken time with this. I read this when I was still working at Apple, and in my spare time, I just went slowly, bit by bit, through this. But first, questa settimana un po' di italiano. Ai fratelli del serpente, il tuo podcast sull'antica architettura è straordinario. Voi sapete ci siete. Ma sul serio, a proposito del trapano Egyptian, non ti preoccupare. So, prima di fare un video con questo, ho bisogno di una pala. Vedo molta neve. A Sorrento l'unica neve è sul Vesuvio, il vulcano. A Sorrento è un bellissimo mulino. È stato rinnovato. Anche le persone che vivono nella neve possono visitare questo bellissimo mulino in questa esposizione sul sito, una mostra, sito di web. E in inglese c'è anche io posso leggere. Certamente è vero. A tutti i fiorentini di Sorrento, Annunziata Barino e Adriano, ciao, grazie mille. Questa introduzione ridicola è un modo per migliorare il mio modo di parlare italiano. Non parlo italiano mucho. Hopefully by the time I've worked my way to the end of this book, and Chris is discussing color theory with Giotto and Fra Angelica, my Italian will have improved. Spent some time with this, 49 minutes actually reading through this with the prologue and the preface. Your mileage and time may vary. I truly was inspired to do this by the Snake Brothers with what they were doing with Christopher Dunn and John Anthony West in various books on Egypt. So, the prologue is pretty interesting. I won't dwell on it much here, but Chris talks about how he starts off, the activity we call building creates the physical order of the world, constantly, unendingly, day after day. In the last 5 millennia, human beings have created millions upon millions of cubic yards of building and millions of buildings, houses, roads, and cities, entire worlds. Our world is dominated by the order we create. This is an important point. We are not separate from this. This isn't just designers. This isn't just architects. It's a huge part of it. But this is really for the benefit and entertainment, hopefully, of everyone. Although we are responsible for the creation of order on this enormous scale, we hardly know what the word order means. Our present idea of order is obscure, and this is very, very interesting. I'll get into this later on here, but he speaks of this. We don't even really have a word for the study of order. We have ontology, that is the study of existence. We have epistemology, that is the study of knowledge and the ways of knowing and truth and things like that. As far as I know, prove me wrong, YouTube, please. As far as I know, we do not have a word with ology that means the study of order. It would be something like ordology, for ordo is the Latin. He does note, in Chris's background, studied as a scientist in mathematics at Cambridge. Got his PhD there before going to the GSD while Gropius was still head of the school in the early 60s at Harvard, and got the first PhD in architecture there. So he has a considerable background. While he was in Cambridge at the time, MIT was just down the street, where I've seen some of these. The computers actually as big as this room is across, the short way, with early computer programs for design problems, really the ancestor of what we call BIM, Building Information Modeling. So, thus what starts out as a way of understanding architecture ends up also as a view which may affect our understanding of physics and biology. When we understand the art of building from this point of view of order, it not only changes our understanding of the building process, but also has the capacity to change our cosmology. And this is not just some kind of New Age thing, although that could be nice. It's really stated, and this is why I want to take this chapter by chapter. This is a requirement to change how we see the world. It's not really possible to address the problems that we have, because a lot of these problems are comorbid with the limitations of the way that we look at the world now. We must change the way we look at the problems in order to solve the problems, because we have exhausted our previous heuristics capacity, really. And so he's discussing in this about a few years ago, I was asked to go to the premiere of a film which had been made about my work. I was reluctant to go. It was a weekend, wanted to be with my family and so forth. He walked up to the stage, and people were cheering and clapping. When I got there, the lights were very bright. They began asking questions. I gave not very good answers. They were probably pretty good. I gave not very good answers. The lights were so bright. We went along for a few minutes. Someone asked me, how did you come up with pattern language? This was his most famous book. It's a collection of solutions, of generalizable solutions to common problems in a way that can be adapted to specific projects. How did you come up with the pattern language? How did you get the actual material? I said, well, it was not very different from any other kind of science. My colleagues and I made observations, looked to see what worked, studied it, tried to distill the essentials, and wrote them down. But, I went on, we did do one thing differently. This is important. I scribbled next to this years ago, in probably 04 or 05, I scribbled GCR next to it, which was an acronym that I used for Greatest Common Reality. This is before I knew what intersubjectivity was. There's the objective, the subjective, and in between it, the intersubjective. And so there's the least common reality, which is one person's perspective. There's the greatest common reality, which is absolutely objective. I noted that. I thought about that a lot when I was younger. We did do one thing differently. We assumed from the beginning that everything was based on the real nature of human feeling. And this is the unusual part, that human feeling is mostly the same from person to person, mostly the same in every person. Of course, there is that part of human feeling where we are all different. Each of us has our idiosyncrasies, our unique individual human character. That is the part people most often concentrate on when they are talking about feelings and comparing feelings, but that idiosyncratic part is really only about 10% of the feelings. Skipping on through this. All of this is wonderful. I highly recommend you get the book and take time with it, but I'm going to hit highlights. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. Concentrated on that part of human experience and feeling where our feeling is all the same. That is what the pattern language is. A record of that stuff in us, which belongs to the 90% of our feeling where our feelings are all the same. When I said this, a sort of cry went up. People shouted and clapped again, stood up and cheered. Then, dimly, I began to understand why they had been clapping when I first came forward. What they saw in me was a voice saying that our shared human feeling has been forgotten, hidden in the mess of opinion and personal differences. Might add to that, lately political. When people find in what moves them, in what moves them in all the work which my colleagues and I have been doing for so many years, is that we have tried to honor and respect the reality of this huge ocean, this 90% of ourself in which all our feelings are alike. This book, at root, is about the core of that 90% of our feelings which we all share. It is about a more realistic conception of the world and the universe which comes into existence and can come into existence only when we acknowledge that to a very large degree we are all the same. Think about shoes. That's the end of the prologue, but seriously, think about shoes. People have found Sumerian shoes. I don't know, maybe the oldest shoes are from Jericho or something. That would make sense, but they're like 5,000-year-old shoes. There are many Roman sandals. This is how Caligula got his name. They called them bootikins. But they have the little shoes have something that supports you and kind of cushiony and grippy on the bottom, and then a tying part on top. And even the most ridiculous postmodern designer would never, out of ironic reference, come up with shoes that have laces in the bottom and padding on top. And if they did, no one would buy it. You might have a model fall down on stage because she's wearing them, and then everyone would, laugh ironically, and it would be dumb. But that's a quick example that there's, brick. Brick is another example, or beds, houses with roofs, right? So, but even the variability, the reason design is actually hard is that even within all that consistency, there are so many changes to make, so many decisions, so many vicissitudes, that it's really pretty hard to get something good. And that's why design is important. So here we are with the preface. What are we doing on time? Ooh, 16 minutes. I hope I can edit some stuff. Section 1, our confusion in architecture. In the 20th century, and he doesn't pull any punches here, which is kind of wonderful. In the 20th century, we have passed through a unique period, one in which architecture as a discipline has been in a state that is almost unimaginably bad. Sure. Sometimes I think of it as a mass psychosis of unprecedented dimension. And he goes on here, one of the things he touches on is this is a parallel with John Anthony West. John Anthony West was, God rest his wonderful soul, John Anthony West, an Egyptologist, a non-conventional Egyptologist, part of the symbolist hermeneutic school of Egyptian study, was somewhat older than Chris, but they both touched upon this. I think in the time that they grew up, they were very, anyone with a brain who wasn't lying to themselves realized that in John's phrase that the world was an insane asylum in which the person who behaved rationally was called crazy. Mid-20th century was kind of like that. Hopefully we're getting better, who knows. It's up to us, isn't it? So, and he says, I don't think architects are happy with all of this any more than other members of the society are happy. I think this is true. But people feel somehow that they have no choice, both consumers and architects. But we do. In the last 2 decades, voices have begun to be heard. People have written, spoken out. Away with the emperor's new clothes. So this is, John Anthony West actually wrote kind of a speculative fiction about this, about the sequel to The Emperor's New Clothes, where everyone tries to convince the boy that he doesn't exist. We can all see that the emperor is naked. Let's not go on with these charades. What is it that has to be done? How should an architect who feels that things are wrong set them right? That's really what this book is about. It shows his attempts, I think many of them quite successful, to set it right, and invites other people to use these tools that he developed, and specifically to view these tools critically. This is not manna from heaven. This is not gospel. We'll see when we get into this. He always says more or less 15 properties. We'll get into what those are and what they do, but more or less. This is big. 2, how architecture depends on our picture of the world. Very few people realize, I think, how much the present confusion which exists in the field of architecture is wound up with our conception of the universe. I have come to believe that architecture is so agonizingly disturbed because we, the architects of our time, are struggling with the conception of the world, a world picture that makes it impossible to make buildings well. I think that's generally true. I think it is even more importantly than the world picture, it is the institutionalized post-industrial systems. This is something that, again, with me learning Italian, all this stuff has been translated. Manfredo Tafuri, a really, I think, really excellent architectural historian, wrote about how capital markets have worked with industry in creating patterns, and it's not conspiracy because no one person or group of people is directing it. It's a general social force of production about how all of this is involved, that it's not just the world picture, although that's part of it, but there's serious momentum. So when we change our world picture, then we are confronting these systems which need to be updated and amended. We must also remember that. He gets into that really in book 3. That's a long ways off. Philosophically, one of the primary tasks of philosophy is to define your terms. Why? Not because you need to explain to everyone, but because often we can confuse ourselves, and we want to make sure that what I mean by something is what you're meaning by something, and that I'm not confusing myself. So, definitions, always. What exactly do I mean by the mechanistic rationalist picture of the world? What I mean, roughly, is the 19th century picture of physics. That is, a picture of a world made of atoms which whirl around in a mechanical fashion. Descartes spoke of this, gets to that later. A world in which it is assumed that all the universe is a blind mechanism, whirling on its way under the impact of the laws of nature. Right, okay, laws of nature. This is coming out of, this was very well articulated by Newton in the laws of motion, and everyone kind of fell in love with this idea of a way of looking at the world. Newton did not look at the world exclusively in this way. Newton himself. Anyone familiar with the history of these kinds of ideas might think of David Hume's billiard balls. That everything, you could understand everything as billiard balls bouncing against each other, and if you could only understand and describe all of the motion and all of the causality, then you could describe and predict everything. We have since discovered, even with computers, it's not possible to do that. Might not even be theoretically possible to do it. But we did get a whole heck of a lot done by giving it a try, so it wasn't a horrible thing. It has its limits. This is important to note, that even if you're not believing this, it's in our culture, it's in our economy, it's in the way that we do things. He's saying, of course, there are relatively few people alive today who wholeheartedly believe that the world is really such a place. Physicists, especially the great physicists. He spoke to one of these. More than one, probably. David Bohm, I'm thinking of. There are relatively few people alive today who wholeheartedly believe the world is really such a place. Physicists have a more humble and wondering attitude about the nature of the universe, so do many non-scientists, architects at least explicitly, rarely concerned with such a mechanistic picture. On the surface, architects appear to be concerned with deeper questions, artistic and social questions, that are often more mysterious and more interesting. That's where he's coming from here. I've reached the conclusion that the strange fantasies, the private in-house language about architecture, the strange people who've gone to school about this understand, people who try to read what famous architects write. The private in-house language about architecture, the strange nature of 20th century gallery art, deconstructionism, postmodernism, modernism, and a whole host of other isms, all of which affect our physical world hugely. That might be a little bit of irony there. Are created because of an entanglement between the nature of architecture, the practice of architecture, and the mechanical conception of the universe. Thus, I believe there is at the root of our trouble in the sphere of art and architecture a fundamental mistake caused by a certain conception of the nature of matter, the nature of the universe. More precisely, I believe that the mistaken confusion in our picture of the art of building has come from our conception of what matter is. This is really important. What is matter? What is this physical stuff in the universe, right? So this was called into question by no less a figure than Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr and Schrödinger. And on and on into Heisenberg. They're saying, wait a minute. The Newtonian model of physical interaction stops making sense when you get down to the subatomic level. This is quantum physics. Okay, so part of what quantum physics means to us at the macro scale, beyond the micro, is, wait a minute, if we're missing something at that scale, as below, so above, perhaps, we're missing a piece of the puzzle up here as well. He's addressing this. What matter is governed by our idea of how space can be arranged, and that in turn is governed by our idea of how orderly arrangement in space creates matter. So it is the nature of order which lies at the root problem of architecture, hence the title of this book, Reconceptualizing What Order Itself Is. When we understand what order is, I believe we shall better understand what matter is and the universe itself. Section 3. What is order? Now this, I wish I could find this. Maybe the internet can help me out. There's an Alan Watts lecture, which I remember falling out of my chair listening to, where he talks about life, which Chris does, and he talks about tapping. He takes off his watch. Maybe he takes it out of his pocket. It was a recording, I don't know. But he taps on the watch crystal and he says, now, what I'm doing here, I'm not going to do my Alan Watts voice right now, but he says, what I'm doing here is I tap on this and it makes a noise. This is a kind of stimulus and response. Now, of course, some people are saying, I'm still paraphrasing Watts, some people are saying that this type of dumb mechanical stimulus and response means that humans also act this way. And in the 50s and 60s, that is what the behaviorists were saying, that everything is a machine, that humans are a machine. This is what Warhol was somewhat celebrating and somewhat lampooning when he painted all over the place, I want to be a machine. He was just embracing this. He was taking what was in the culture already and throwing it in people's faces. That's what it was. But Alan Watts was observing this and saying, hold on a minute. Turn this around. Instead of being upset about it, I'm saying hooray. Because he's saying that doesn't mean that humans are dead inside. He means that this is alive. This is a very simple form of life because of the stimulus and response that is happening. That's very important. Redefining what life itself is, and what the thing that made me think of Alan Watts. And I discussed this with Bin a little bit. I tried to discuss this with Bin, and we did. The podcast episode is on the Ageless Art podcast, which is linked to below. Highly recommend you look on it. Very good discussions there. So there is a conception of Li. There's Qi, which is an Eastern idea from Chinese philosophy and medicine that very many people in the West know about, which is life force, vital energy. Okay, and it's in humans, it's in rocks. Everything has a kind of life force. There's Li, which is the force embodied as order. It's not order in the sense of 1, 2, 3, 4. The literal, as I understand it from Watts, the literalness of it means the markings in jade and the fiber in muscle. It's that Li means that type of order. Okay. Chris doesn't go on about that specifically, but this is something that I've thought about and written about. If you want to understand what he's getting towards, I believe that looking into that Chinese tradition can help elucidate it, if you want to know more about it in detail. So there we are. What is order? We know everything in the world around us is governed by an immense orderliness. Yes. Skipping along here, this is on page 10. In facing any one of these tasks, I come up, in a sense, everyone knows what order is, but when I really ask myself, what is order? In the sense of deep geometric reality, deep enough so that I can use it, and so that it is able to help me create life in a building. It turns out that this order is very difficult to define. Right? I think the Chinese were pretty good at this. And what does he do? He references Chinese architecture, not an accident. He's talking about that there. That's the Yellow Goose Pagoda in Hunan Province, China. That might be an error. I think I remember Bin telling me something about that. It might be in a different place. Wikipedia can tell you. But, so he says, look at the yellow tower. On the facing page, it has the smile of the Buddha, of life and simplicity. It moves us in the heart. I want a conception of order subtle enough to explain the way the yellow tower makes us feel, right? Because he realizes that there's something about the nature of the geometric order of the tower itself, because what else would it be? There is something about the arrangement of materials that is provoking, like tapping the watch. The tower is provoking something in us that speaks to us. We, humans, I mean, spoke to the materials. And this is the sense of dialogue. He doesn't touch upon this here, but this is a co-creation dialogue. People understood in dialogue their own feelings with the materials when this thing was built, and understood well enough to create something harmonious and beautiful. And now, this extant thing continues to speak to us in this beautiful way, still hitting something in us. This gets to Kandinsky, another thing to get into. He talks about the metaphysical piano, that his way of understanding expressionist art is that the artist, or the craftsman, is creating something that is like a piano to human feeling, to the human mind. Geist is the German word he's using to the sense of the spiritual, mental, non-physical consciousness. Geist. That's the best one I've ever done. Geist, non-physical consciousness. There we go. So with something that is created by the artist or the craftsman is striking certain chords in them. Chords are struck in them as inspiration. They create something which is in resonance with that. That thing, then separate from their creation, provokes similar, distinct yet similar responses in the viewer or the participant. This is a very important dynamic. So here in the next section, Chris talks about, he does a very brief yet thorough, on page 10, redux of historical conceptions of the nature of order coming through Western thought. He talks about Ludwig Boltzmann, in 1872 with entropy. This is big. Entropy tends to be stuck in our brains, that order is negative entropy. Obviously, this has limits. He talks about complex patterns. He talks about a hierarchical sociological order, but none of these are really getting fundamental enough. He makes oblique reference to his own previous work here. A city is not a tree, in which you have a kind of semi-lattice of sociological, non-hierarchical, non-strict hierarchical order, overlapping hierarchies. That's important, but this is distinct. This is something else entirely. He says that the biologists have gotten the closest, really. I'd agree with that. He mentions catastrophe theory. That is a type of order. Catastrophe theory, as far as I understand it, is the idea of transformations through time, and that you have branchings in time. And that, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got processes of development happening, and then something affects it, and there's a point of no return, the catastrophe, at which point the system changes. So this is, catastrophe theory is important to cybernetics, to the study of systems, of dynamic systems, and how they change over time. Catastrophe is a point of irrevocable change where it significantly changes. Not always bad, sometimes adaptively and sometimes good. He gives some examples of order, and he makes the distinction here that some types of order are better than others. In the wake of the late 20th century, this is incredibly controversial, and he talks about that, but he gives some examples here, both ancient and modern. That is the tomb of Tamerlane, right there with that dome, columns, and some modern examples of a glazed canopy in England and structural steelwork in Berlin. And I can attest to the fact that that German steelwork really is beautiful. Although this is from the Botanical Garden in Berlin, in the Palm House. If anyone doesn't want to go to the Palm House in Dahlem, then you can go. A much easier place to find is, I'd recommend the Friedrichstraße Bahnhof, right in the middle of downtown, which also has really, really beautiful structural exposed steelwork. And then, here are modern examples of types of order that are very orderly, but they're not really that great. He does not have universal praise nor condemnation for Frank Lloyd Wright. He does not like the Marin County Civic Center. That's the one at the top. That is Saarinen's Milwaukee Art Museum, the old one. He likes what Calatrava did, somewhat. He has reserved praise for Calatrava's new Milwaukee Art Museum, which I thought was nice. But and then these horrid banks, which people from California will recognize as old things. Yeah, I used to do banking in one of those. Order as mechanism. Okay then, so the discussion of order as mechanism, section 4, is really an explication of how the billiard ball system of Hume has become just so pervasive that we don't even realize that we're limiting ourselves to it. But that's, to a great extent, that's where we are. And immediately, section 5, René Descartes. Yes, there is much discussion of Descartes in this. This is the introduction of it. The mechanistic idea of order can be traced to Descartes around 1640. His idea was, if you want to know how something works, you can find out by pretending that it is a machine. Pretending. You completely isolate the thing you are interested in, the rolling of a ball, the falling of an apple, the flowing of blood in the human body. From everything else, you invent a mechanical model, a mental toy, which obeys certain rules and then will replicate the behavior in the thing. This is design, specify, execute. This covers a lot. It even covers our education system, that we imagine what we're going to do out there in the world. Good luck, go do it. Instead of what I've been doing with Brian, what I did with Alessandro in Italy, of a very different approach. He admits that Descartes spoke of this as just a method, discourse on method, you know? This is not a description of fact, this is a heuristic. It's a way of looking at the world. And we need to realize that, because some people have made that confusion, that they think. Now this is very interesting. He says the first thing that happened in the 20th century mechanistic viewpoint, what the 20th century did, again Alan Watts touches upon this, that they went from a semi-automatic model, from the model of the universe as the clay potter, that the demiurge creates the world. Different cultures see, the people from ancient India felt that the world was dreamed into existence, that all of the world is actually the dreaming divinity. In the Far East, in China and Japan, the Taoist-influenced cultures believed that the world was spontaneous growth, like we observe with plants and the Tao. What we understand as the West believe that things were sculpted, were made. So what the 20th century contributed was to take the demiurge out of the picture and to see it as purely mechanistic of its own physical interaction. Descartes did this with separating res extensa from the res cogitans. The res cogitans inside the head, res extensa outside. Became formalized in the 20th century. The picture of the world, the first was that the I went out of our world picture. The picture of the world as a machine doesn't have an I in it. It did with Descartes. It was cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The one thing that he could not doubt was the self. In the 20th century, the self began to be doubted radically. And that was mentally and culturally traumatic, as we've seen. The picture of the world as a machine doesn't have an I in it. The I, what it means to be a person, the inner experience of being a person, just isn't part of this picture. Of course, it is still there in our experience, but it isn't part of the picture we have of how things are. So what happens? How can you make something which has no I in it, when the whole process of making anything comes from the I, comes from the creating individual? And this, again, this touches upon, he doesn't get into this, but there, I think, is a very useful parallel in the very ancient flower of life style metaphysics of creating center, perimeter, circle. Next point of creation is Vesica Pisces, where the single circle doubles, right? And this is how creation, it's not even a metaphor, it's a structural parallel of how the process of making something, of the process of development happens. And it always begins with the creating center, with the initial point of consciousness. The second devastating thing that happened with the onset of the 20th century mechanistic world picture was the clear understanding about value went out of the world. The picture of the world we have from physics, because it is built out of mental machines, no longer has any definite feeling of value in it. Value has become sidelined as a matter of opinion, not intrinsic to the nature of the world at all. And with these two developments, the idea of order fell apart. The mechanistic idea tells us very little about the deep order we feel intuitively in the world, yet it is just this deep order that is our main concern. Now, from ontology, the study of existence, he shifts to epistemology, study of understanding, knowledge, construction of fact. This is not just one thing. You find out when you take it seriously. It never has been just one thing. The real nature of this deep order hinges on a simple and fundamental question: what kinds of statements do we recognize as being true or being false? This is the question which divides the mechanistic worldview originating with Descartes from the one which I describe in this book. Skipping on a bit, the worldview I am presenting, a second kind of statement, is also considered capable of being true or false. These are statements about relative degree of life, degree of harmony, or degree of wholeness. In short, statements about value. This is important because he's going over two things here. I have the benefit of him already working out and laying this groundwork, and then me thinking about it for years and bringing my prior experience to it. He is talking about two things. There's a relative degree of wholeness and harmony that is a spectrum. It's not bivalent. This is really important. He touches upon this almost as if he just understands it and is already working with it. I don't think he mentions directly that there tends to be either A or B, black or white, that 20th century thinking did not deal logically with spectrums very well at all. This has changed in recent decades. What I call soft logic, multivalent logic, Bart Kosko, Lotfi Jade are great figures in that. And so that's important, that this is not black or white, this is not yes or no, we're dealing with spectrums, degrees of life, degrees of wholeness. And value becomes important in that because it's not a yes or no, it's a how much. It's about relative. And then there is the idea of the degree of harmony. So this is fact that is not necessarily about physical causality, not fact about motion, not fact that's about billiard balls. This is fact that is about harmonious structure and the emergence of structure. This is a very, very, very different way of looking at the world. I, for one, am slightly convinced that one of the reasons that Egyptian things, they've always fascinated people, but there's been an uptick lately. Why? Several reasons, but quite possibly because the way that we are understanding the world in human culture and human mental psychology and philosophy has turned around again in the cycle of human development to a point where we are understanding things more, not exactly the same, but more similarly to the Egyptians than anyone has since the Egyptians. Specifically the idea of harmony itself, the way that we understand sound, the way that they understood sound, the way that we understand, we can understand what they meant by order. Well, the nature of order. The Egyptians used a word called ma'at, which they believed was their idea of order. We're coming around to that again. And Chris says, in the view I hold, these statements about relative wholeness are also factual and are the essential statements. They play a more fundamental role than the statements about mechanisms. It is for this reason that the view of order which I am presenting in this book inevitably involves a shift in worldview. To bring things down, he immediately gets into the pragmatic. He says, suppose I'm trying to place a door in a certain wall. While I'm trying to decide where to put it, you can make various mechanical statements of fact. You can spec it out, say where it is. And he goes on and on with all the physical specifications you can make about this door. All those statements are potentially statements of fact in 20th century mode. This is the sense in which the word fact is understood today, about physical consequence. It is generally agreed that statements of this type may be true or false, but if I'm trying to put the door in the wall, there's a second kind of statement. When the door is in a certain range of positions, the result is more harmonious than other positions. This has been taken. This is obviously very important, because if you're designing something, this is the part of design that isn't engineering. All that stuff he's talking about is part of engineering. It's extremely important. Designers and engineers should work nicely with each other. Should. So often do. But there are considerations that move beyond that type of fact. Now he's saying that this is not opinion, this whole harmony thing, this whole good design thing isn't mere opinion. There is fact to it. That if you place a door a certain way, it will be better and more successful for people than if you place it the other way. This is controversial. However, I agree with what he's saying. And this is important. We are constantly trying to make decisions about what is better and what is worse in an evolving building. If the only statements considered potentially true or false are mechanistic statements of fact, and the false statements of harmony, beauty, what is better or worse, what has more life or less life, are always considered matters of opinion, which can only be referred to private and arbitrary canons of judgment, then, in principle, rational discussion about buildings should be impossible. Now, there are some people who are architects who actually believe that to be true. Read the works of Daniel Liebeskind, read the works of Peter Eisenman, to see people who believe that. You can look at what they produce, you can look at what they write, and then the question is, do you enjoy it? Do you truly enjoy it? Do you think that type of thing, do you think there should be more of that type of thing or less of that type of thing? These are important questions. He speaks of pattern language, published in 1977. My colleagues and I published a book called Pattern Language. In this book we made a number of observations about good environments. The book was and still is extremely controversial. Many people enjoy it though. It describes a number of key patterns. Some people said it described an important form of truth. Others said it was impossible for the book to describe any form of truth and that it was only opinion dressed up as truth. See, and that's part of the argument there. I think part of the big confusion there gets back to what he touched upon but did not explicate, which is the bivalent problem. That some people are assuming that instead of being titled a pattern language, that it is the pattern language. They assume that these are supposed to be eternal capital T truths. These postmodernists are forgetting themselves when they say that they're straw-manning a bit, because there they say, they're tearing it down because they say that it attempts to be something which they believe doesn't exist. Chris and his colleagues had no such pretensions. The highest form of praise that they ever had for any of this was towards an invariant. Not invariant, but towards an invariant solution. So, the proof really is in the pudding. He says, however, after the book was published, many hundreds of other people came to the conclusion that the statements in pattern language are not statements of opinion, but are, in some sense, true. Since patterns seem to confirm people's instincts about what is true in the environment, to these people who were not committed to the mechanistic canon, the patterns represented a triumph of deeper wisdom reflecting common sense. Right. I had the experience reading this book. I felt like the book was reading my mind, because I had been walking around observing things about architecture, but thinking, yeah, why is this seeming this way to me, and not quite understanding it or trying to puzzle it out. And then I would come across, and other people told me they've had this experience too, then you come across something in pattern language and you realize, oh, yes, this is accurately and quite eloquently describing just what I was feeling and trying to think about. And that's really, I think, what is valuable about it. And not just that these things are in the book, but that this clear articulation of what people are feeling and observing about what is good or can be good can be discovered in any project. Because it's not a pattern language, it's not the pattern language, it's a pattern language. Different pattern languages are created, which are going to share a family resemblance, but will all be different. Different pattern languages for each project. We've already had some good success here with people enjoying the pattern language process. I did some years back. Plenty of other architects have used this. It's very, very helpful. And people love doing it. It's enjoyable. He goes on, as I hope to show, this new extended idea of truth is not only objective, but it is also directly linked to people's feelings. More importantly, this extended idea of objective truth will allow statements about relative harmony, wholeness, and so forth to be judged as true or not true. These kinds of statements are not left as private, intuitive opinions or agendas, but describe the structure of things in the world as they are. This next section is about the destructive impact of mechanistic thought in the art of building, so it describes the problems. I'm not going to dwell on these several pages here today. There's plenty of evidence all around you of stuff that can be improved. So, Section 7, the next one is a new vision of architecture. In this new view of order, we shall find necessarily a post-Cartesian and non-mechanistic idea of what statements can be true. A theory in which statements about relative degree of harmony or life or wholeness, basic aspects of order, are understood as potentially true or false. This is important. I think what he touches on later, probably in Book 2, is, I don't think he goes so much in depth into this. Bin touches on this quite a bit, is that in how we understand temperature, how we understand sound, how we understand color. He's extending the boundaries of science to understand something quantitatively in a way that has only been expressed qualitatively. Or I don't think that's the right distinction. Consciously, what has been understood unconsciously. In this new view of order, we shall find necessarily a post-Cartesian and non-mechanistic idea of what kinds of statements can be true, a theory in which statements about relative degree of harmony or life or wholeness, basic aspects of order, are understood as potentially true or false. This means we shall have a view of the world in which the relative degree of life of different wholes is commonplace, and a crucial way of talking about things. And this is something that my colleague Brian is tremendously interested and very, very good at dealing with. He says, such a new view of order will create a new relationship between ideas of ornament and function. In present views of architectural order, function is something we can understand intellectually. Ornament and function are cut off from one another. Ornament, on the other hand, is something we may like but cannot understand intellectually. Right? Because ornament is treating to this sense of harmonious order, but it does not treat to a mechanistic function. People who take Sullivan superficially think that there is a cognitive dissonance in his own work, that he talked about form follows function, yet his ornament was so detailed. He understood, you have to realize he understood ornament to have a function. Ornament does something to you. Sullivan was very much in the same place that Chris is, talking about how when you look at something, it has a sense of power of life to it. Sullivan wrote about that explicitly, about the development of geometric form over time. Another beautiful part of this book is that I do like footnotes better than endnotes. Each chapter has at least one page of endnotes here. Christopher Alexander was very thorough with his citations in this. It's really wonderfully done. And sometimes there are comments in that are worth reading. We'll get to those. So this is the end of the chapter here. So he's saying about how this can transform the way we see things. Everything will look different. Not only buildings, flowers, puddles, waterfalls, bridges, mountains, the moon, the earth, the tides, the waves of the ocean, paintings, the rooms in which we live, the clothes which we wear, all of these will be different in our eyes and will appear to us as something fresh and marvelous. We shall then literally be living in a different mental universe. At that stage, we shall not only have a concrete grasp of order as a single phenomenon which affects all of architecture, but shall also be led to a view of space and substance which is transcendental. Although this conception of order is lucid in material terms, it will also provide us with partial understanding of the nature of matter which reaches beyond our present material view of substance and beckons to some domain beyond the limits of space and time. No, but seriously, Yes, the beyond space and time, right? Because it's book 4 is called The Luminous Ground. Book 4, this is physics, okay? He's he's very Aristotelian in many ways. This is physics. After physics, there is metaphysics, right? So book 4 is metaphysics. Brian might convince me to skip ahead to book 4. Thus, it is not only the detail of what order is that needs to be questioned, but also the very nature of order. So long as we have confused or inaccurate conception of what kind of thing order is, we shall inevitably make buildings which are ugly, houses which do not support ordinary human well-being, gardens and streets which are at odds with nature, and at a world which destroys our souls. To make good architecture, we must fundamentally alter our idea about the nature of order, about the kind of thing it is. It's that kind of polemical rhetoric which has really made a lot of people angry. I don't think it's necessary for them to be angry, but they do get very upset because they feel like they're putting very, very good efforts. They feel like they are trying hard, but you know what? Sometimes things are problems. And he's very good at pointing out how we can overcome problems. It's delightfully incisive rhetoric as well. And this is very important. He said nature of order there, and he put in footnote 24. Thus is not only the detail of what order is which needs to be questioned, but also the very nature of order. The nature of order, not just order itself. Footnote 24. The possibility that the order observed in science and the order created in art might ultimately be treated as one phenomenon has been mentioned by many writers, starting with Goethe. In recent writings, see for example Gregory Kiep's and Hermann Hesse, Glasperlenspiel, cites his own work, The Bead Game Conjecture. I really wish he would dwell on this, but that would make this volume even larger if he went on how this stuff comes out of Goethe. And perhaps that is the job of people like me, to explain when people want to hear about it. I'm not going to explain about Goethe right now. If you would like me to, you know what to do. So, at this point, thank you for listening. This has been part 1. My colleague Brian is playing the piano with headphones. I think he should talk about this. Let's ask him. Brian! Okay. So let's get ourselves both in frame. There we go. Okay. So, Brian has been hearing me go on and on about this for like multiple years, so he can call me on anything, which is important. So he has also very carefully read this book. So this is book 1, chapter 1, right? It's the worldview. So do you have any thoughts that you want to say about book 1, chapter 1? No, this isn't even chapter 1. This is book 1 in the preface.
Because there's different ways of getting a different world shift, I guess, of course, anyway. But is this like way of doing it the best, and the fundamentality of that, I question. But there are valuable things to the whole thing that are nice to take away.
Yes, and I think the question of best is, again, I was speaking earlier about one of the important things that he mentions in here is to go beyond, when he raises the question of value, fundamental to that is the idea that it is there. We want to get beyond the idea of black and white. So in that sense, the question of best is eclipsed by what is useful. Because I don't
like just pure utilitarianism too. Also, well,
that's important to dwell upon. Go on about pure utilitarianism, because that's really what the mechanistic worldview leaves us with, is utilitarianism.
Yeah.
It keeps us trapped in it.
and like a strange postmodern thing. And then if you're taking like the a la carte method to life and philosophy and way of living. But with this specifically, I like it in the way that if you're messing with clay specifically, or drawing something, you can start with the blank sheet and move forward. It gives you a way to just do something. If you have nothing else to do, I guess, or some like other driving force.
Well, this raises the question of the I, of seeing the creation as not alienated from the self.
Which, yeah, right. You get there as an artist, and then you have the weird spooky moments that happen, and it takes on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
But also, yeah, it has its own shimmering stuff if you kind of stare at it for long enough. And that's the thing, that it takes time. So, yeah, that's kind of the scary part, too. Just how much time it takes.
Well, and that's...
people to slow way down. Like, there's a whole bunch of dumb building stuff on Twitter.
Yeah.
Maybe this will be more interesting, going around value in architecture, all these different things. This does give you back value in a nice way, where you're not just doing pure economics as business. Also, you're doing it for kind of like ethical reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is the reintroduction of value, and in the sense of slowing down, I think there's a double-edged sword to that, because with the work that we've done, you have a slowing down of the steps. You're slowing down your mind, but in one way, because you slow down your mind and you make choices that are of a power and are of a harmony much greater than you would have otherwise made. The whole develops much, much more quickly. And that is something that we experienced. We did a workshop a while back with people here in the community where they did things out of clay, and then Brian was able to go just kind of step by step in using this type of methodology. And we were both very positively surprised at how a really wonderful structure surfaced out of that very quickly.
Fired. Yeah, we have ways to fire it.
You're firing that one now?
No, not now.
Not now.
It will be fired.
It will be fired.
Yeah.
Did you preserve that one or not?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be able to see that later on, the thing that Brian made in that workshop. So, ornament and function. You might want to say something about ornament and function.
Yeah. I guess I get asked more, like, what is ornament? Whenever I say ornament. Like, I'll be sitting at Fong's Pizza, which is done up to look Japanese in the middle of Iowa, but the building outside is very nice, and the building in is really nice, and it's been reused in a really nice way.
Isn't Fong a Chinese name?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just like
they're
you
being
can't
eclectic.
tell. Yeah.
Okay.
Because you get a kamikaze shot there.
I see.
So
they're being eclectic.
very, and yeah. So they have a good pizza deal, and it's walkable. So I go there when I go to the ceramic center, and she was just like, I was saying that I want to ornament a building, and the bartender was, what is ornament? And that's the question that I get all the time.
Now this is really interesting to me, and this is a little bit sad. That do you feel like people are wondering, or do you think like people are being philosophers when they ask this, or do they genuinely not know what the word means?
They just don't know, and then I have to like show them.
They don't know what the word means.
Well, it's a nice opportunity though, because you say like, okay, well that rope that's put around the trim, okay, well the wood trim itself is ornament. She's like, oh, okay, cool. But also the rope, it's kind of cool that they did that. Like, I don't know why, but it just looks nice. And other things like, there was a big giant medallion on a wall, like, so that's also ornament. And she's like, oh, so like this lamp, like, yeah, so it's got like these laser cut things and it shines and it does cool things. That is also ornament. Like, okay, like, yeah, you don't have to have boring places. Like all the clutter, it's actually good for your brain.
There you go. You can have things that are, if we're being purely utilitarian, we are not addressing the whole human.
Yeah, it's awful. Ugh, yeah. bureaucracy stuff. It does also help just to go to Italy, but it helps more to play in the mud. Like, really, that's the best thing.
You can play in Italian mud,
You don't have
or
to.
volcanic
Like,
sand
just
or
get
something.
mud and just start playing.
You can play with
that's
anything,
what they
yeah.
do in India, and they make ornament, or Bali, and they make great ornament. So like, just start, use whatever.
I think that's a great thing, is that the hands-on part of this, however much it is important to examine your fundamental assumptions, to examine what you're thinking about what you're doing, the doing itself is primary. Something Chris mentioned over and over again in the times, brief but significant that they were, that I was very happy to interact with him, talking about it is what you're building. What you are building is what matters. All right. On that note, thank you. Do you want to do this again next week?
No.
No? Aw. Convince him, Internet.